You've probably heard of the Baha'i Faith. It's known all over the world for its core message of unity, the unity of God, of religion, and, all of humanity. And holding that whole idea together is something called the covenant, which is supposed to guarantee this perfect, unbroken line of leadership. But does the history of the faith actually live up to that promise? Okay, let's really get into it. So, here's what we're going to cover. We're going to trace the story of this covenant. We'll start with what it promised, then we'll look at the very first split right at the faith's origin. We'll see how those divisions continued inside the founder's own family, then dive into the massive leadership crisis that kind of shattered the faith into a bunch of different factions. And finally, we'll take a look at the wild landscape of Baha'i groups that exist today. All right, so first things first. What exactly is this covenant that's so incredibly central to how mainstream Baha'is see their own faith? I mean, that is a huge claim, right? Just think about it. Pretty much every other major religion has a history packed with succession disputes and schisms, but the Baha'i Faith presents itself as the one exception, that it's divinely protected from all that internal conflict. This idea of a perfect chain of command is absolutely foundational. Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. Because when you look at the historical record, like our sources lay out, you find a story that's way more complex and, honestly, a lot more contentious than that ideal of perfect unity might suggest. So let's see how that claim holds up when we dig into the history, starting right at the beginning. You'd think the first major leadership crisis would happen, generations down the line. But no, it happened right at the faith's origin point, during the switch from its parent movement, Bahaism. Okay, so this timeline shows it all. The very first split happened right at the faith's birth. Before he was martyred, the founder, the Bab, was crystal clear about who his successor was. He named him. But after the Bab died, a different and much more powerful claim popped up from inside his own community, and it directly challenged that appointment. And this is where it gets really personal. It's all about this relationship. The Bab's chosen successor, Mirza Yahya, was the younger half-brother of Mirza Hussein Ali, the man who would become known as Baha'u'llah. So when Baha'u'llah announced he was a new prophet, he wasn't just making some spiritual claim. He was directly stepping over the authority of his own half-brother, the appointed leader. This, as you can imagine, created a bitter and permanent split. So think about what that means. According to the sources we're looking at, the very creation of the Baha'i Faith as a separate thing from Babism was itself an act of breaking a covenant, the one the Bab made with his chosen successor. And this pattern of fighting over who's in charge, it didn't stop there. In fact, it's almost like a carbon copy of what happened plays out in the very next generation, this time between Baha'u'llah's own sons. So, Baha'u'llah laid out what seemed like a clear plan. His oldest son, Abdul-Baha, would lead first, and then the younger son, Muhammad Ali, would take over after him. It was supposed to be a nice, smooth transition between brothers. But it was anything but smooth. The two clashed hard. It ended with Abdul-Baha excommunicating his own brother. And boom, another schism was born, creating the Unitarian Baha'is. So lightning strikes twice. A founder's own will for who should lead after him was broken. The very covenant that Baha'u'llah himself put in place to guarantee unity ended up fracturing under the weight of a family power struggle. Now, as messy as those first two splits were, the third crisis, well, it was arguably the biggest one. It led to the massive fragmentation we see today. And it all centered on the next in line to lead, a new position called the Guardian. Okay, so Abdul-Baha tried to solve this whole succession problem for good. He came up with a new institution, the guardianship. This was supposed to be a hereditary, infallible leader who would guide the faith forever. His grandson, Shoghi Effendi, was named the first one, and, as it turns out, he was also the last one, at least for the mainstream faith. And right here, this is the breaking point. The man who was meant to be the first in a long, perfect line of guardians died unexpectedly. He didn't have any kids, and this is the critical part. He didn't leave a will. He didn't name a successor. The very system designed to prevent division suddenly created a huge power vacuum, and it threw the entire faith into chaos. So what happens when there's no leader? Two main factions emerged from the void. On one side, you had a council called the Hands of the Cause. They took control and basically argued that since there was no will, the guardianship was over. They went on to form the Universal House of Justice without a guardian, and that's the mainstream Baha'i administration today. But on the other side, a guy named Charles Mason Remy declared himself the second guardian, insisting the faith simply could not exist without one. But here's the kicker. Remy's movement didn't stay together either, which just shows how deep these splits go. His own followers broke into multiple Guardianist sects, each one claiming a different line of succession. You've got the Orthodox Baha'is, the BUPC, the heart of the Baha'i Faith, and then there are the Tarbiyat Baha'is, who are run by a council while they wait for a future guardian to show up. And this wasn't just an internal religious argument. Eventually, it all spilled out into the legal system. In 2008, a U.S. federal judge who was looking at all these competing claims came to this really powerful conclusion, stating that, quote, "The chain of successorship lacks a link. The supposedly perfect chain was, in the eyes of the court, broken." Okay, so up to this point, we've focused on schisms over who's in charge, right? Administrative disputes. But the divisions in the Baha'i world actually run a lot deeper than that. They go right down to core beliefs and theology. Just take the Aqdas Baha'is, for example. Their split has nothing to do with leadership. They believe the mainstream faith basically buried the true teachings of Baha'u'llah's most important book. And their beliefs include stuff that's totally different, like karma and reincarnation, plus social views on things like patriarchy and race protection that are worlds apart from the mainstream faith. And believe me, the list goes on. You have the Reform Baha'is, who argue that Abdu'l-Baha's will was a complete forgery. Then you have the Daheshists, who believe their leader was the spiritual return of the Bab himself. There are even groups like the Quratis, who followed one of the Bab's first disciples as a divine messenger. The sheer diversity of belief is just staggering. So when you add it all up, the sources we've been looking at point to more than 15 distinct Baha'i sects and divisions. For a faith that's only a little over 160 years old, that's a truly remarkable amount of fragmentation. Which brings us right back to where we started. The history we've just walked through is a story of constant, repeating division, from the very first succession right up to today. So it leaves us with this fundamental question to think about. If a faith's core promise is an unbreakable covenant of unity, what does it mean when its history shows that covenant has been broken time and time again?